Hello, my name is Chess Goon. I'm the chess expert that is here to make you better at chess, one video at a time. And today we're going to go over 5 crucial endgames that most chess players mess up. Position number 1, the pawn push. In this situation, I want you to notice that all the action is coming right here on the queen side, and there's actually a winning idea. Now, the king isn't going to be fast enough to stop one of these pawns from promoting. So what we have to do is cause a pawn break. And this happens after we push the pawn to g6. And in this position, if you don't take the pawn back, either g takes h or g takes f, and we will promote. So of course, we have f takes g. The mistake that many chess players, even at the higher levels, make is simply just playing f takes g, pawn takes back, pawn takes back. And in this situation, even though the king is closer to the pawns, our opponent will still be able to stop us from getting into the action. We won't be able to win this pawn, and it's a complete draw. So the question remains, what can we play to convert this into a winning endgame? And it's actually quite the tricky answer here. So if we go back before we take, right, notice that after f takes g, we don't have to take the pawn back, but we can actually play the ridiculous h6. And h6 is quite an amazing move because if the pawn takes here, so g takes h, we have a passed pawn and there's no way to stop us from promoting. We've sacrificed 2 pawns, but we will get a queen. But okay, what if the pawn doesn't take here? Well, that's pretty obvious. If the pawn doesn't take, and let's say g takes f, we just take back, and it's the same situation, except we have one less pawn to clean up. Okay, guys, position number 2, the king and pawn endgame. This one's extremely crucial, and many people make mistakes here. So notice that we do have the extra pawn, but in this position, you can actually go ahead and send a draw. You see, after king to d4, our opponent has something called opposition, which means after king to d6, he's facing our king. There is exactly 1 square between the 2 pieces, and he will just be able to mirror our moves. If, let's say, king to c4, he goes ahead and attacks the pawn and we lose. If we go ahead and play king to e3, our opponent's king will go to e5. And the point is we will never be able to get in front of this pawn, right? It's automatically losing. So if we keep pushing the king up the board like this, you would think, okay, eventually we might be able to promote, but it's not true. After king to e8, we either have to leave the pawn hanging or play king to e6. And notice our opponent's king has nowhere to go, and this is actually a draw. This position seems a lot better, and it could be winning depending on whose move it is. Unfortunately, in this case, it's actually white's move, and you'd wish that it's black's move because after king to f4, the king can simply just come to f6. And you see in this way, the king has opposition, and we have no way of getting the pawn going forward. If, let's say, king to d4, king to d6, and okay, push the pawn, and now you're in a very familiar position. Notice that we're about to fall behind the pawn, and it's exactly like we saw before. We've gotten pushed behind the pawn, and we will never be able to get in front of it again. This is a drawn position as well. Now, this position, however, is winning for whites because it is actually white's move here. If it was black's move, it would be the same scenario as earlier, but because white's going, we have king to d5, and now we have the opposition. So black would have to play, let's say, c7, and that's fine. King to e6 and roll out the red carpet for our pawn. He will promote. Okay, if he backs up, that's also no big deal. King to d6, and we still have opposition. King moves over, king e7, and once again, the red carpet is out. So once again, guys, the way to win these types of endgames is to understand opposition and use it to your advantage. Let's move on. Position number 3, the Rook and King endgame. And this position should be pretty methodical, but black does have one trick to force a draw. So in this position, it's white's move, and we're going to play rook to h4. And what we're doing here is blocking the king off from the last 3 ranks. If the king comes to e5, we have rook to h5, and this technique will slowly cut off the king's space. Notice now the king has less space than before, and the rook will stay on the 5th rank until we can push the king back. So now the king is trying to approach our rook to take. We have king to f4, and if the king goes to g6, Be careful not to play something like king e4 or move away from the rook, guys. Remember, we need the rook, otherwise this is just an even drawn game. So don't hang your pieces here. Simply just rook to a5. And notice now the king is going to have no choice but to either come back to f6 or go to h6. Of course, the king can move back as well, but then we have rook to a6, right? So let's say king to h6, king to g4, and the king is forced to come back to g6. Once again, we check with the rook, and notice the 6th rank is now cut off, and the king is cutting off f5, g5, and h5. So we're slowly suffocating the king and taking away his space. King goes to f7, and let's say king to f5. What you need to watch out for here is, like we discussed earlier, opposition, which is what we need in order to actually push the king backwards further and further. Notice that after king to e7, the king comes to e5, and we're not actually in line with the king because the king can just keep moving towards the rook, and there's nothing we can do about it. If this happens to you, simply play rook to h6. And notice now the only way for the king to approach our rook is to come back towards us. And now mean we'll be able to push him back with h7. So king moves over to c7, let's say, king d5. Eventually, the king's going to end up forced to the last rank. And that's when we play rook to h7. Now, this will be where the king finally rests. Let's say king to c8 and then king to d6. And notice once again that if the king goes to d8, it's checkmate. So the king will move over to b8. And eventually we will catch him and it will be game over. And one more little trick to avoid repeating moves. If let's say king to e5, instead of playing king to e3 and giving your opponent opposition, or moving the rook all the way back to h4, simply play rook b4. It's a high-class waiting move, and either the king moves away now and we can start moving towards the king and win, or the king will be forced to play something like d5, and now we have the same technique as before. Position number 4, the queen-king endgame, and this one is essential to know. It's an easy-to-win position, but you have to watch out for ideas of stalemate. So simply put, it's black's move here, and we can play something like queen e3. And now we are blocking the king off from all of these squares. Remember, the queen is much stronger than the rook. It takes up a lot more space, and we also take over diagonals, so we can slowly cut off the king. If king to d6, we don't even have to bother moving the king. You can actually play this technique, queen to e4, and we're going to slowly force the opponent's king into a corner, right? So let's go queen to d3. Now our opponent is forced onto the last 3 files. And after king to c6, we're just continuing to suffocate our opponent and force him into a bad position, right? King to a8. And watch out here. There's a big mistake that many people will make in this position, and it's queen c7. Notice that in this way, our opponent's king has nowhere to go, and he's not in check, meaning that this is a stalemate. And even though we're up 9 points of material, this is a draw. You shake hands and you go home. We don't want draws here, friends. Instead of queen to c7, be patient. Just play queen to d7. And now the king will have at least 2 squares to go back and forth, a8 and b8. And we're slowly going to approach with the king and then eventually deliver the checkmate on b7. Big takeaway here, force the king into the corner, but make sure he has at least 2 squares to go back and forth between so you don't get a stalemate. Final endgame position that you must know is the queen versus pawn. And this position is actually a bit trickier than it may appear. So our opponent is looking to promote on b1, and that's a theoretical draw. What we're looking to do here is check the king and force him to eventually play king b1. If we can force our opponent to play king b1, we're going to be able to slowly get our king closer and eventually win this pawn. So we keep chasing back and forth. We're careful not to repeat moves, and eventually we have king b1, and we can approach with the king. We'll continue this technique until eventually our king can come closer, and we'll win the pawn and the game. An important distinction that you should know here if you're playing black is that if you have the edge pawn on either the A or H file, you actually can force a draw here. This is a theoretically even position, even though our opponent has the queen. Notice in this way, after check, the king can go to a1, and yes, the queen can just keep getting closer and closer, but now we have king b1, king b2. There's no way to force the king away from the pawn without allowing the pawn to promote. Normally, edge pawns are worse than center pawns, but In this case, our edge pawn just saved us a loss. However, be careful for this one little beginner mistake. King to a1. And in this way, we've actually given up checkmate and it's just game over on the spot. But yes, the king can keep approaching and getting closer, but there's no way to stop this pawn from promoting. You're going to shake hands, and that's going to be a draw. Overall, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you found this video to be constructive and useful, I highly recommend checking out this video down below. This is about the 7 most common chess mistakes that you are most likely making right now. Go ahead and check that out. Stay classy, my friends. Until next time.